Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Future of Urban AI. This is a collaboration between Urban AI and the Cornell Jacobs Urban Tech Hub. We are finishing up today our second season of the series, which is an exploration of the future of urban tech horizon scan that was published by Cornell Tech 2 years ago in 2021. If you've been with us before, you're aware that what we've been doing is exploring through a number of talks the different forecasts within this network graphed view of the future where AI is really playing a key role. And today is the final step of that journey. We've covered most of the map of the future. There's a lot more AI still in there to be teased out, but I think we've covered most of the big topics. And I'm really delighted to end the series with our guest, Mariela Alfonzo, who's the founder and CEO of State of Place, who's going to be talking about how we can use all these technologies to improve our streets for people. So Mariela, I welcome you and turn over the stage to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm super excited to be here. Right. All right, so as Anthony said, I'm Mariela Alfonso. I'm the founder and CEO of State of Place. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey of how I got into the world of AI and urbanity. So I grew up in Miami, but I always quick to say not this Miami. I'm a first generation Latina. I'm a daughter of a single mom who was barely getting by on a secretary's salary. She was raising me and my brother with special needs. So this was my Miami. And my version of Miami meant poor schools and poor infrastructure and poor mobility. And sadly, the death of my 15-year-old friend who was killed while crossing a 6-lane road, just like the one that I crossed on a daily basis. Now, the thing is that the post-2020 world has made it excruciatingly clear that where we live predetermines how well we live, from who suffers from diabetes to who can safely access a park, to who's impacted the most by floods, to who can access a good job. And as someone whose lived experiences were shaped by many of these spatial inequities, I've spent the last 20 years quantifying how the built environment shapes us, our behaviors, perceptions, attitudes, choices, and then how in turn that impacts economic, health, environmental, and social value, or quality of life, with the goal of using this more data-driven and evidence-based approach to advocate for more livable, equitable, and sustainable places that people deserve, or what you can call spatial justice. So let me walk you through what I mean. Remember these two places from earlier? Let's sit with them for a minute. How does each place make you feel? Which place do you prefer? Which place might you avoid? Well, their design has a lot to do with how you're feeling, but design impacts more than just your feelings. It influences the places we go, how we get there, what we do when we get there, and how safe we both feel and are there. And then this translates into the tangible stats and metrics that matter to city makers and the people they're making these cities for. For example, reducing collisions or getting children to safely walk to school, or improving health outcomes and mitigating greenhouse gas, or reducing gun violence and improving community well-being. It's all interconnected, this relationship between people, place, and quality of life, or infrastructure, behaviors and perceptions, and yes, KPIs and ROI. You can't really look at one without understanding the other. And indeed, when one side of the equation, design, is divested, that translates into the other side, people disproportionately suffering because of that divestment. And in the end, we all bear costs tied to this spatial inequity. Both the moral and economic costs are untenable, amounting to over $7.2 trillion annually in health, climate, crime, economic inequality, and more. But today we've arrived at a reckoning point in terms of racial equity and justice. There's an unprecedented generational opportunity that's created by several new federal policy initiatives with over $1 trillion behind it. And the existential threat of climate change, sadly, has never felt more real. We have a whole historic opportunity and responsibility to foster more just, thriving, and resilient places. And many of us are here today because we want to do just that. But the thing is, it's been painfully clear that how design impacts us, for better or worse, has been inequitable for centuries. So the question is, how do we arrive at a more spatially just world? What should technology's role be in getting there? And perhaps most pertinently, why the heck aren't we there yet? So first, it seems like planners, architects, developers have been dreaming of utopian versions of cities since basically the beginning of civilization. City making has tended to be quite reactionary in a very, this is absolutely the way to fix it. We'll all live happily ever after if we only do it my way kind of way. From City Beautiful, Garden Cities, Radiant Cities, Broad Acre Cities, and even the neighborhood unit, they all claimed their planning scheme was the way to live happier, healthier lives. But none worked. Actually, partly because what actually got implemented were watered down versions of their visions, which is usually the case when you're trying to implement grandiose, good on paper visions. But more fundamentally, they didn't work because utopias don't exist. But even today, we're still lulled in by these fairy tales. We still need to be careful not to fall into utopian thinking. Modern day versions of it, like one could call the 15 or 20 or even 1 minute city, and other similar catchy headline planning proposals on their face, are overly simplistic. In many ways, this is by design, because they're meant to be a heuristic and not necessarily a catch-all. But they offer such simple sounding solutions, and the world craves simple so much that they do tend to fall prey to the same issues as previous utopian plans, and they often lack context. And next thing you know, you have conspiracy theorists accusing its proponents of some sort of covert plan against freedom and humanity. Now, don't get me wrong, the basic planning principles behind the 15-minute city are sound and in line with what's needed to create more livable cities. But many of the utopian plans that preceded it were also noble in their intentions. The problem is that cities are messy. And so these trite, verging on cliched approaches overly simplify the problem and the solution. I mean, look at what happened with open streets during the summer of 2020. Were they indeed safe for us all? Were they being implemented equitably? Plus, what happens when a backward planning ideology comes into vogue that we disagree with, as it has many times before? Being led by ideology alone is dangerous, and believing in utopias will always disappoint us, leave us blindsided, and then worse, can open the doors to dystopian visions. So speaking of, it's no coincidence that many of these utopias have been offered up by those wielding a lot of power, which historically have been represented, well, let's just say one gender, one race, one sexual orientation, yes, cis white males, and older ones at that. So how does the saying go? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And while Jane Jacobs may have famously won the fight against Moses to put a freeway right through Washington Square Park, he succeeded in many other mostly Black and brown neighborhoods, which she and many others didn't stand up for. So sadly, not much has changed since then, except today it seems like the tech billionaires are the ones who suddenly have decided that they can make new, resilient, sustainable cities with all the tech from scratch. Apparently, being a billionaire qualifies you to be a city maker these days. But it's not just the rich and sometimes famous that wield power to influence what gets done. Top-down approaches are still the prevailing way that we create places in this world. And public participation, or rather public input, which in and of itself isn't accessible and is often done mostly to check the box, isn't the same as bottom-up, community-led co-creation, which is the only way we can ensure that what we create actually reflects the needs of who we're creating it for. And finally, both utopian thinking and power-led planning are underpinned by overly reductionist thinking, that if you build it, they will come. We call this environmental determinism where I'm from. And goodness, if the post-2020 world hasn't shown us that humans are, well, complicated. I mean, if people aren't taking life-saving vaccines, I'm not sure how we think the design will automatically lead to any specific outcome. The built environment simply allows for an opportunity for something to happen. It doesn't guarantee it. And we should be weary of making grand promises without the evidence to back it up. But even the smart city movement, which is ostensibly led by data, is foolhardy in a similarly reductionist way. Deploying a ton of expensive sensors isn't going to cut it if they're just collecting a whole bunch of data that no one really knows what to do with, or how to interpret, or how to translate into actual solutions. Data is not evidence. You need to process and analyze data to transform it into evidence, and it's the evidence that can more effectively inform decisions, not merely raw data. And then there's the expensive tech that makes the status quo slightly only more efficient, if not treated as part of a more holistic solution. Simple solutions are never that simple. EVs and the like, while they should be considered as part of the solution, are not panaceas. Now tell that to the pedestrian killed by the self-driving Uber car and the many others killed since, or the victims of those crushed by the too smart by half pedestrian bridge in Miami that collapsed and killed multiple people when they could have just redesigned the street to make it safer for people to cross at ground level. Now, as someone who currently sits squarely within the smart city movement, I believe in its potential, but many city makers I know are skeptical. While many smart city solutions have introduced data into the city making equation, many are only telling cities how they're performing today and not how to become the cities that they aspire to be. It's like being able to predict if you'll get a chronic disease, but stopping short of telling you what to do if you get it or how to prevent it, period. And this is partly due to using kitchen sink approaches, which throw as many data points as they have access to at an equation in a large scale model with the goal of achieving the most accurate predictability possible. But these models sometimes incorporate spurious data or two things that have nothing to do with each other. For example, sour cream purchases correlated to motorbike deaths. And I'm being trite. But because the goal of large-scale models, especially unsupervised deep learning models, is often to maximize the predictability of models, these unrelated, sometimes nonsensical factors can sometimes slip into the equation. And when they are sensical, many of those factors, city makers can't really change them. So while they may be really helpful in predicting problems, they're not helpful in addressing them. So in other words, when it comes time to offer up solutions to say, reducing the number of motorbike deaths, it's difficult to point to what built environment investments city makers can actually make to achieve that goal. So in the end, city makers are still struggling to foster more just, thriving, and resilient places. For some, federal, state, and even private capital dollars could be flowing, but there's still never enough money to do everything that people want and need. And whether it's the public, nonprofit, or even private sector, there are always capacity constraints which translate into trade-offs. So every day, city makers face tough decisions of what to fund, where to focus, and who to disappoint. And then how do they actually ensure that the dollars they're spending on community scale infrastructure projects will most effectively, cost efficiently, and equitably maximize value and quality of life? So moreover, for all the talk about AI and smart cities, most folks are still making decisions based on what they've done before, who's loudest in the room, what deal can be more easily financed, and they usually work with the same folks they always have. So then when it's time to gather all the yeses that are actually needed to make that project a reality, financing, approvals, buy-in, community trust, they're actually faced with a sea of no's, primarily because they lack data and evidence to help them justify why their project is merited. Well, because they didn't actually use data or evidence to help guide that project. And then they're rarely involved. They rarely involve the people that are actually going to be impacted by that project to begin with, at least not in a meaningful trust building way. So a lot of these projects get stalled, and sometimes rightfully so at best, or collect dust at worst. So basically it can all be distilled down into these two persistent problems. How do you do the most with what you have and do so equitably? And how do you gather all the yeses needed to actually get that done? And so enter my work with State of Place. We believe that the power of AI and tech is best harnessed when it's used alongside sound social science-based models and guided by the community. So as I mentioned before, my life's work has been to connect the dots between place, people, and value. And that work is now translated into State of Place, my AI-driven technology and research platform that digests a ton of data, converts it into evidence, and translate that into software that provides planning tools and recommendations that city makers can equitably optimize the value of the built environment, and then effectively co-create and communicate that value to help build trust, win approvals, secure financing, and get that stakeholder buy-in. So let me show you how it all works and how we've implemented this in various communities. So first, I mentioned that my work quantifies the links between the built environment and value. So the first thing that we needed to do was figure out how to measure place. I won't bore you with my stories of how back in the day we collected this data with paper and pencil out in the field, but let's just say there's a big win for AI here. In any case, today we extract data on over 125 community scale infrastructure assets like sidewalks, benches, crosswalk, trees, lighting, different building uses from street level images using visual machine learning models that we have trained. Our algorithms then crunch this data into the State of Place Index, which is a score from 0 to 100 that measures built environment quality across 10 different aspects of urban design that we measure as separate sub-indices. The software then visualizes this data graphically to showcase an area's assets and needs block by block, and then spatially to help city makers target and prioritize divested areas of opportunity. So the software is giving a full inventory of what's working and what's not, and where, down to which street lacks trees, playgrounds, or lighting. But that's really just the diagnostic part. As I mentioned again, for over 20 years, I've been quantifying the exponential value of place. And during that time, we've built a series of forecasting models that can help identify the most effective interventions and then drive that value and predict that value. So one of the first models I built was via a Brookings study that I co-authored. We collected state of place data and economic data for over 60 neighborhoods across the DC metro region along a continuum of walkability and equity. And then based on a hierarchical regression analysis, we found that for every 20-point increase in the state of place index, there was a $9 increase in office rents, $7 in retail rents, a $300 unit increase in residential rents, an 80% bump in retail revenues, an $81 square foot increase in home values. And then places with a higher state of place index had residents with lower levels of education, lower incomes, and had higher concentrations of historically marginalized people. So this study really sparked the idea for creating a more tech-enabled product, now State of Place, as it was clear that we had a powerful diagnostic tool and then a built-in rationale for why investing in place mattered for economics and equity. Now, fast forward several years later, after we had launched the State of Place software and developed our AI models, that really allowed us to collect a lot of data for regions and more easily create these models. So we worked with Philadelphia to help build an evidence-based narrative around spatial injustices in the city to show that basically the same vulnerable communities that were typically most harmed by other crises, higher rates of chronic diseases, higher exposure to environmental hazards and risk, higher crime rates, were those most vulnerable to threats like COVID, and that there was a common thread: poor urban design. They also wanted to help craft a story by identifying investment opportunities that could optimize quality of life and foster spatial equity. So we collected state of place data as well as social, health, environmental, and equity data for 17 zip codes throughout the city across a continuum of vulnerability. And we visualized how state of place was tied to all sorts of quality of life outcomes, from COVID to floods to heat waves and a host of equity factors. But mapping the tragically obvious that place impacts people's lives inequitably only helps them so much. So we turned that data into evidence and found that places with a lower state of place index were tied to higher COVID rates, higher rates of chronic disease, especially COVID comorbidities, higher flood and heat rates, and higher crime. And we also found that these places had higher concentrations of Black, low-income, less educated residents with higher household sizes, less access to a vehicle, and were less likely to work from home. Our regression models were able to quantify that an increase in 5 points in state of place translated to 1 fewer COVID death, 5 fewer folks hospitalized with COVID, and a 20 points was tied to a 0.5% reduction in transmission rates. To put it another way, places with an above average state of place index had 37%, 41%, and 83% fewer positivity, hospitalization, and fatality rates, respectively. And similarly, places in the floodplain scored 17% less on the state of place index on average than those that weren't. And it was the same story with heat. An increase of 10 points in the parks and public spaces subindex was tied to a reduction in temperature of 0.5 degree, which really adds up. Meanwhile, places with a below average state of place index had 8.7 times more homicides. Now, we also worked with the city of Durham to help inform their Vision Zero goals. Specifically, we collected built environment data for known collision hotspots and then compared them to non-hotspots. And we found that for every 1 point increase on the state of place index, the odds of a collision were reduced by 12.3% on average. And then when you drill down into the impact of the specific aspects of the built environment on vehicle collisions, some urban design changes were even more critical to address in terms of saving lives. For example, the presence of parks and public spaces was tied to over a 25% reduction in collision rates on average for every 1 point in that dimension. We've also quantified the links between the state of place index and vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, for Caltrans, which is California's Department of Transportation, to help California cities reach their greenhouse gas reduction targets. So we collected state of place data and other land use, transportation, and equity data for 60 census tracts in Northern and Southern California. And we found that VMT increased as density, transportation access, and the state of place index decreased, and as income and vehicle access increased. Or again, in other words, on average, places with a higher state of place index located in compact, transit accessible, lower income neighborhoods drove more than 2 times less than those that were in sprawled, auto-oriented, higher income places with a lower state of place index. And then in the city of Henderson, in Nevada, we mapped 50% of their blocks across the city using the state of place index and profile to understand the relationship between design and property values to help inform strategic investment throughout the city. And we found that for every 20 points in the state of place index, that both assessed value and property taxes increased by nearly a quarter, which really, again, adds up citywide, which then helps to justify capital investments in certain areas. So while these findings may seem very academic, because they are, our software translates them into actionable recommendations and priorities for urban design improvements that will most effectively and cost efficiently lead to desired outcomes. So you see that based on our forecasting models, it turns out that some urban design features matter more than others, depending on what goals communities most want to achieve. So some things matter more for driving retail revenues versus reducing asthma. So rather than start by asking what design features a community wants, the software allows users to indicate which quality of life outcomes they want to improve. And similarly, in the same way that some urban design features matter more than others depending on desired goals, some features like the street grid are much harder to change once they're in place than others, like aesthetics. So users can also indicate how feasible it is to make certain changes within their context. So our software will generate recommendations based on a user's desired goals, an area's existing state of place index, and what the evidence says about the relationship between those goals and the index, and then the feasibility of making built environment changes in that user's context. So in other words, it translates what would normally be pretty academic, cool but academic, findings into practical, actionable recommendations that are most likely to help city makers achieve their goals and optimize value. So for example, in the case of Durham that I mentioned, they're not only using state of place data to help prioritize which of those intersections to focus on, since they don't have the budget to address all of them, but also get contextualized evidence-based recommendations that are most likely to help them save lives. And since we also know the state of place of a typical hotspot, this can help spot potential hotspots or near misses and improve their urban design before any further loss of life. Now, the next thing that we do is our software provides kind of like a SimCity-like scenario tool that allows users to pull their state of place data for the proposed redevelopment areas that they're focused on. In other words, they can see their existing conditions and then co-create project and investment ideas with multiple stakeholders and communities. They can then test how those built environment recommendations, like adding a park or street trees or bike lanes or crosswalk markings, would not only impact the state of place index in real time, but then also predict how those improvements translate into real life impacts, like what we saw before. So increases to tax revenues, fewer or no collisions, decreased chronic disease, less violence, or reductions in vehicle miles traveled. And this way, you can not only ensure that investments actually optimize all of this value, but that you can clearly communicate that impact in a simple, effective way that truly reflects people's priorities and lived experiences and helps to get you that needed trust and buy-in. So, for example, one of our customers, the city of Tigard near Portland, Oregon, they use this scenario tool to enhance their community engagement process with an underserved part of the city to involve them in the city making and actually co-create project ideas with them. Finally, the software's forecasting tool calculates not just the impact, but also the return on investment of proposed projects and investments. And this helps city makers more readily justify their decisions, ensure that their plans maximize the bang for the buck. And of course, it helps them get the capital that they need to get their projects done. So, for example, on the private sector side, we've not only helped several real estate developers use this before-after data to get city council approval or get financing for their projects, but also even make changes to their original conceptual plans to increase the value they're creating for communities. And because the forecasting tool quantifies that upside, especially the economic impact of built environment investments, including increases to residential rents, city makers can get ahead of displacement threats posed by redevelopment by outlining policies and subsidies that ensure that the delta in increased rents, both on the residential and retail side, that would make that area unaffordable otherwise, gets addressed and built into the project via mechanisms like community land trust or community benefit agreements. Now, as a little teaser of what's to come, we're in the later phases of working with the DC Transit Authority, WMATA, and the University of Maryland to integrate state of place data across the entire system into their transit ridership models, which will not only help increase their predictability of those models, but also make them actionable. So WMATA will be able to identify capital improvements that they can make along their stations to not only improve quality of life, but also ridership, which means value for them. We're also doing a phase 2 of the original Brookings study that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to basically have before, after data spanning 10 years. So get in touch if you want to learn more about that. We're really excited about this opportunity that this kind of first of its kind longitudinal data set on these microscale urban design features unlocks. So in the end, while there are no utopias or simple solutions, there is real power in place-based evidence in driving better decisions and communicating the why behind those decisions in order to create more just, thriving, and resilient places. But to do so, we need to embrace complexity. Yes, the world of Twitter and TikTok, or X now, has bite-sized attention spans. But that doesn't have to mean that we make decisions based on the equivalent of 140 characters. Now, the good news is that data and evidence, while rightfully complex, need not be complicated. We just need to remember that tech is a means to an end and not the end. And therein lies the real power of AI and tech within the urban space, in my humble opinion. I'm very much looking forward to continuing to work with this community to translate social and data science into clear and tangible recommendations that can actually, in real life, improve people's lives. Because I truly believe it's our best hope that where we live will someday no longer predetermine how well we live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariela. That was fascinating. You started out, I think, kind of pointing out some of the shortcomings or oversimplifications of the 15-minute cities approach, and then, invoke like the right-wing backlash that has happened. And as that's been unfolding, I've always thought, well, 15-minute cities was a political slogan, so we shouldn't be surprised by a political backlash. And I think what you've shown us is that, like, when you dive into the details, you can actually start to like help communities find a consensus around what they want their streets to do, and to allow them to create the narratives about what's good about it. And I think this is an incredibly powerful set of tools for people to cut through that noise. We have a ton of questions piling up in the chat window, so I'm just going to start at the top and invite Julianne to come and ask a couple questions you had. If you'd like to come on video and unmute yourself. If not, I can ask it for you. Okay, so I will. Where did you get the data from, and did you build and train the models from scratch or use pre-trained models?
Great question. So on the data side, on the built environment data, we are pulling that data from street level images like Google Street View or other equivalent types of street level images. So we source that data and then apply our models to it. On the visual machine learning model side of it, we use a combination of some open source visual machine learning models that we then trained additionally to kind of look at the specific features that we're looking at, because there wasn't a lot of the features that we look at, there are no models. And then we've trained a lot of our models on the visual machine learning side from scratch. We also use OpenStreetMap data for some of these features directly. It's like maybe a third of the features. And then sometimes we use a combination of the visual machine learning models and OpenStreetMaps to kind of further validate and improve our models. On the outcome data side, like things like diabetes and economic factors and things like that, we often work directly with our city customers in pulling that data. So a lot of them already have open data that they have pulled, sometimes better than others. So we do a lot of cleaning of that data, and then we use other open source data in this regard, and of course census data.
Thank you. Paul Salama, you have a couple questions. Do you want to bring yourself forward, or should I ask them for you?
All right.
There he is.
So yeah, hi. Let me know if you can't hear me.
We got you. You're good.
Great. So one just very quick question is, have you correlated the data with like property taxes? So I'm thinking of like Urban 3, Kazi, and some of that analysis as well.
Yeah. So we've done the model that we did in Henderson, Nevada, was specifically on property taxes. And we're working because when we did the Brookings study, we tried to do property taxes, but it was across so many jurisdictions that there was so much noise because they all did their assessments differently. So we let that go. But we are updating the model right now for the city of Bowie. And we're going to attempt to do property taxes again by just focusing on the isolating the different states. But we already have a model that we've done in Henderson that looked at property taxes, property values, and assessed tax.
And is there a correlation, or is there any relation that you're finding?
Yeah. Sorry, I know I was showing a lot of stuff, so it was in a previous slide, but yeah, I think I said that there was like a difference of like a 25% increase in property taxes between. Don't want to quote me wrong. Hold on. Yeah, this one. Yeah, so for every 20 points. So it was almost like a one-to-one relationship there.
And then the other question I had, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would imagine that there was maybe not necessarily necessarily that correlation, but it's hard to see. So the other question was, give me a second, I actually try to find it. Oh yeah, so can state of place software or index, can it be integrated into like existing processes, or is it really a services contract when you're working with government?
I mean, we would love to have this integrated. We're in early discussions with the city of Houston. There, everything there gets done because it's so funny with the lack of zoning. With basically the economic development department, and they work individually with developers creating community benefits agreements, and that process is fuzzy because it's like they don't really have a way to quantify like what the increase in the value that the developments that they're assessing will bring. And so it's really hard to determine, well, what should the community benefit agreement be? And so a lot of the community benefit agreements end up being like, oh, well, you make sure that you hire locally, or you're going to create certain jobs and you want to keep that local. And so it's really just have to do with the creation of the project and not like later on in the life of the project. So they can, the idea that we've been discussing is, can something like this, of course they can't mandate state of place, but can something like this inform that kind of process where it becomes more standardized, more predictable, and more effective, because they're actually using these predictive models to like quantify what that upside will be and then address that, both for cost equity concerns, but also economic development. But so it has the power to be integrated in that way. We often work, with cities more when they call on us, and the way that we work with them. Sometimes they're using the software themselves. Sometimes we're doing more sort of like custom research and tech that then leads to the creation of new products. Sometimes it's somewhere in between.
Super fascinating. Thank you.
Yes, and I would love for you guys to connect afterwards, because Paul is very humble, but he's been working at Cornell Tech as a urban tech fellow on some approaches to automating environmental impact assessment. So I think there's a good potential connection there. Hubert, you had a couple questions and comments. Do you want to jump up and share those?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks a lot, Mariela, for really like the fascinating and inspiring presentation. First question, it was regarding the index, but actually you answered it. I was wondering like if you are mainly creating it by aggregating like data from like urban infrastructure in like the images you are collecting, but apparently yes, like you are mainly focusing on those data, like data from the Google Street images.
Yeah. So it's both Google. It's the images themselves. Google Street Views is one source, and then also the OpenStreetMaps are the two primary sources. Sometimes cities have a few features that they have databases on, like maybe some cities have looked at things like tree canopies. Some have like a sidewalk inventory. So if cities have pulled any of that, of course we integrate that and validate it across our models. But usually one of the reasons that they're bringing us on is they don't have this kind of inventory. So
and then it was just a quick observation, but in the beginning of this series we tried to explore the use of generative AI in urban planning, and one of the first episode actually, so circling the loop, was dedicated to the use of generative AI to participatory approach, participatory design. And I was really fascinated by the second part also of your presentation, when you explain how you can use your index at the service of this participatory design to really involve people, participants, citizens in city making. I really believe it's amazing. And I was just making a connection with one of the episodes we had a few weeks ago on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm fascinated by the generative AI, and I see a lot of potential to integrate this. Like we spent so much time updating the software to have it be easier to kind of search the raw data, because before we just sort of put the index and the sub indices, but people really wanted to know, it's in there, it's in the software now, but it was really hard to kind of pull out. So we have this whole filter section, and I was like, oh, you could have just been like, can you just like, I just want to be able to type in, show me this, you know? So I mean, and that's just like the tip of the iceberg. I think like exactly what you said, like we're really trying to flip the script on how you approach communities. You know, it's like nobody asked, you know, this example has been used to death, but it's a good one. Like nobody asked anybody like, oh, do you want the iPhone? Nobody would have thought of that, you know? So like, why are we asking communities, do you want a bench here or like a sidewalk here or a bike lane there? They're not experts in this regard. They're experts in, no, I want to be able to walk my grandchild to school, you know? So starting the conversation from there and then working backwards, I think that there's a lot of power there to explore generative AI and how to enhance that process for sure.
I think that's it. I had one question, which is building on the question about data sources. Like, are there other sources of data out there that you would like to grab? And the one that came to mind for me was dash cam data. Like, would higher frequency or higher resolution or anything like that improve what you're doing, or do you have more than enough data?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've been part of this organization called GCTC, which started about 10 years ago, and we're now rebranding as the Global Communities Technology Challenge. It's connected with NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is part of Department of Commerce. I say all this because part of what we're trying to do there is to develop open standards for smart cities. And as part of that, they're really trying to push open source. And it's always been like an interesting thing as a private sector company, like how do you deal with open source? Because I believe in it. We obviously have used open source models for our own purposes, but then you know, how do you make that viable? So one of the things that we're going to be working on next year is kind of using State of Place as a test case for how open source might be integrated into a private sector business model. And one of the things that we want to tackle is the image collection, because right now we pay Google basically to source those images. It's not free, and we do it through a third party. You know, and there's no reason why cities couldn't be collecting this data themselves. So if we, you know, we can help create the standard of exactly how the images need to be collected, so that that can be used to extract all of this information. Because otherwise they're just purchasing it over and over again. Like there's just such a like poor use of resources. You know, even for example, when we did the city of Philadelphia, it was a small pilot project. They had images. They had somebody that they paid to collect those images. But because we were able to use those images, we gave them 3x the number of streets that we would have been able to do under the regular budget if we had to go source the images ourselves. So they could see it's a huge economies of scale question. So absolutely. Yes, I'm all for finding other ways to get these images.
Excellent. I think we will stop there. I'm going to once again thank Mariela for sharing. It was a fascinating look at how we can cut through the noise around urban design to improve our cities. Let me just quickly share this. As I said at the outset, was the last session of this series. We do not have a cliffhanger ending for you, unfortunately. But we do have all the episodes up on YouTube, with the exception of last week's session with Soledad Guilera, which will be re-recorded and posted in the next couple of days. But if you go to tinyurl.com/future of urban AI, you can see all 16 of the sessions. And hopefully we will be coming back maybe with season 3 next year. We'll see. But I'd like to thank you, Bear, thank all our guests, and thank all of you. So long.
Thank you.